Hi everyone, and welcome back to another wonderful lecture. As promised, we are going to talk about the Mongols today. The Mongols are one of my favorite groups throughout all of history because, I mean, they were extremely barbaric and they built the largest empire that the world had ever seen at this point in time. And it was just, it's just great. Like, I can't explain it without actually delving into it. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So, first and foremost, let's kind of set the tone here. So, late in the Middle Ages, we know and understand that Europe was going through this really dark time and they had, stopped learning, and now they were venturing into the East through the Crusades to try to take back the Holy Land. And the Crusades were happening between the 11th and 14th century. But when you look at the Muslim world, the later Crusades weren't even mentioned. Why? Well, there are some good reasons why. During the 12th century, the Muslim world became fractured. So you started to see those Islamic caliphates just break apart. So in the Middle East, you had the Seljuk Turks who took over. You had an offshoot of the Abbasid dynasty that controlled, Egypt and northern Africa, and then you had the Moorish control over Spain, who were completely independent of the, other caliphates or other Islamic civilizations into the East. You also saw that the Crusaders weren't taken seriously and weren't seen as a major threat in the Muslim territories. So Muslims called the Crusaders the Franks, and they were viewed as very barbaric and weak and poorly led. A lot of it has to do because they were constantly fighting with one another, and also because Europe got really small during this time. The largest cities in Europe only measured in like 20,000 people, whereas the cities in Muslim territories, like Baghdad, for example, had like hundreds of thousands of people. Because remember, Europe was shrinking during the Middle Ages because it was their dark period. But the rest of the world outside of Europe, they were experiencing their golden age. They were flourishing, they were expanding. And yeah, like the Crusaders were laughable. And also because they lost. Crusades are successful failure. And a lot of this has to do with the reason why they weren't taken seriously is because there was a much bigger threat coming from the east, and that would be the Mongols. Dun, dun, dun. So let's watch a little bit of Heimler's video on the Mongols.
Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. In this video, we finna be talking about the Mongols. Now, thanks to John Green over at Crash Course, everybody loves the Mongols now. But if you had lived during their reign and you had resisted them, they would have given you the Black Plague, catapulted your dead, bulbous, oozing body over the defensive walls of their enemies in order to spread the plague to them and eviscerate their entire population. So back then, we wouldn't have bought t-shirts with the Mongols on them. We would have evacuated our bowels at the first sign of their approach. Even so, I admit, the Mongols are pretty awesome. Why does John Green always have to win? Doesn't matter, let's get to it. Now, over the course of world history, many pastoral peoples took the stage, but by far the most significant of them was the Mongols. The Mongols emerged in the 13th century and within only a few years controlled the largest land-based empire in all of human history. But what's strange is that even though what I just said is 100% true, the Mongol Empire itself left a very small cultural footprint on history. They gave us no new language, no new religion, and no lasting civilization. So let's get into all that they accomplished and how they accomplished it, and in order to do that, we need to start with one individual by the name of Temujin. And that name might not mean anything to you, but you might recognize him by the title he was given later in life, Genghis Khan. So Temujin was born in the 12th century into a network of Mongolian tribes that were fractured and at war with one another. And through a series of unfortunate events, Temujin and his family became social outcasts without much of a way to scratch a living. Even so, Temujin's personality was so magnetic, and he soon forged critical personal alliances among all the the Mongolian tribes. Not long after that, he was recognized as a chief among his growing band of followers, and as such, he gained himself a reputation for brutality and ruthlessness with his enemies, and secured a healthy string of military victories. Now, one of the distinctive methods of his conquering is worth noting. In large part, instead of destroying his enemies or making them his slaves, he actually incorporated them into his own tribes. And on the wave of his growing power in 1206, a Mongolian tribal council named him Genghis Khan, the ruler of a newly unified Mongol nation. And just to be clear, historians of late have changed the spelling of his name to Chinggis Khan, so it's the same guy, just don't get confused. And so now that he was the Chinggis Genghis of all Mongolia and had a powerful army at his beck and call, what would he do? Well, I suppose he could have been satisfied in his accomplishments and sat on the porch of his yurt sipping yak milk for the rest of his life. But that's not what he did. So here's a life lesson for you. When a leader has supreme power and an army at its beck and call bent on destruction, you expand. Gotta have goals. And that's exactly what he did. Now, Genghis Khan's first leg of expansion was into China. In 1209, he perpetrated his first attack against the Chinese, and that set in motion the expansion of the Mongol world empire. And his attacks were fierce. A recent scholar said it this way: in a flash, the Mongol warriors would defeat every army, capture every fort, and bring down the walls of every city they encountered. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus would soon kneel before the dusty boots of illiterate young Mongol horsemen. And my question is, how could the Mongols, with a population of less than 1 million people, do such a thing? So let's try to answer that question. What tactics gave them the ability to conquer so many other people? Well, the first thing to note is that the Mongol Empire grew without a guiding blueprint. It's not like Chinggis Genghis sat down with a map and drew some lines and said, now that's my empire. No, they just went out and conquered, and the more people they conquered, the more resources they had to keep conquering. And in many cases, the odds were patently not in their favor. For example, when they invaded China, the Chinese population outnumbered the Mongols 100 to 1, and the Chinese possessed far more advanced technology. But in large part, the Mongol success lay in the organization of its army. Genghis Khan organized the entire Mongol society into military units of 10,000 and 1,000 and 110. And with such organization, he was able to quickly and effectively control and command his troops. And when he conquered a people, they got swept up into that organizational structure as well. Except that he scattered them among different units so they wouldn't think about rebelling. And in this way, Genghis Khan created a growing army that was fiercely loyal to him. But not necessarily because they loved him, but because they feared him. In fact, his policy was that even if one member of a unit deserted, the whole unit was massacred. This reputation for brutality actually did a lot of the work for him as it spread to the places where he was headed. His policy to those surrounding nations was as follows: whoever submits shall be spared, but those who resist, they shall be destroyed with their wives, children, and dependents. So obviously he was kind of a moderate. But despite those words, he actually did have a reputation for tolerance. Take religion, for example. Genghis Khan allowed people to keep their religion so long as their devotion to that religion did not become the center of political opposition. So wherever the Mongols encountered Christians or Buddhists or Muslims or Taoists, he largely let them be in terms of their beliefs. Now, we've been talking about Mongolian conquest in general, but let's look at how two specific cultures responded to them: China and Persia. The Mongol conquest of China was the most difficult and extended of all, and it lasted 70 years from 1209 to 1279. It began in northern China, and the Mongols' concern was destruction and plunder, but the further into China they moved, their concern changed. As they worked their way into southern China, they were more concerned with accommodating the local population. For example, they allowed landowners to keep their land as long as they pledged loyalty. Now, regardless of the different methods employed, the result of the conquest of China was the unification of China. In fact, some of the more learned Confucians were convinced that the Mongols had been given the mandate of heaven to rule over their people. And while they were in China, the Mongols fit pretty nicely into the Chinese mold by using existing systems of administration and taxation. They even established a new dynasty called the Yuan dynasty. And under the authority of this dynasty, roads were improved, canals were built, scholars and artists were patronized, so the Mongol leaders very much ruled like beneficent Confucian leaders. Even so, their rule in China was relatively brief, only about 100 years. By the mid-14th century, they were forced out by factionalism, numerous peasant rebellions, and the plague. Okay, that was China. Now let's see what happened when the Mongols encountered the Persians. This conquest was far more abrupt than the one in China. In relatively short order, the Muslim Persians fell to Mongol attacks, and to the Persians, This reality was deeply disconcerting. After all, the Mongols were infidels, and how in the world could a band of non-believers conquer them so easily? And not only did the Mongols conquer them, they slaughtered the Persians with a ferocity they had never known before. A Persian historian of the time recounted it like this: "Every town and every village has been several times subjected to pillage and massacre, and has suffered this confusion for years, so that even though there be generation and increase until the resurrection, the population will not attain to a tenth part of what it was before." In fact, in 1258, in the sacking of Baghdad, the Mongols put over 200,000 people to death. But what's interesting is that the Mongols were far more influenced by the Persians than the Persians were by the Mongols. They made use of the Persian administration system and left many Persian rulers in place. Most significant, though, is that the Mongols who conquered Persia became Muslim. And this kind of large-scale conversion didn't happen when they conquered China. And as for the end of Mongol rule in Persia, it was much different than it was when they were driven out from China. In Persia, the Mongols just sort of disappeared gradually. Mainly, they just over time sort of assimilated into Persian culture, and eventually they found out that there was no more Mongols left. Okay, that's the Mongols. If you're trembling in your boots, you did it right. If this video was helpful to you, then subscribe.
Alright, so moving right along. I highly suggest that you guys watch this video because it really helps to put in perspective the different dynasties of China, the different major dynasties. And it's actually a really good earworm, and it really does help you remember, especially when it comes to your AP exam. So I'm going to play it here for you now.
Right. You know, we have a song which we teach in class to help people remember the names of the major dynasties.
Right. It really does help to know which dynasty comes before which.
So we're less concerned with the dates than we are with the chronological order, the sequence of dynasties. Right. Can you sing that song?
I cannot sing it as well as you can.
Well, shall we sing it together?
Ni Changba.
Only if we sing it together.
Okay.
Zhangzhou Qin Han, Zhangzhou Qin Han, Sui Tang Song, Sui Tang Song, Yuan Mingqing Republic, Yuan Mingqing Republic, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong. So if you sing...
Did you get it? If you sing this a couple of times, randomly, you'll be able to get each of these dynasties in order. If you don't believe me, ask me in class, because I can recite it. All right, moving right along. So the Mongols, just to give you some background, they were a semi-related nomadic tribe that lived in the steppes of Asia. They came with the Indo-European migration from southern Russia. So this is like way back in the day. And they shared similar ancestry with the Persians and the Aryans. So we're going back to the ancient Middle East. So the Mongols lived in a very harsh climate. There was very little rain. There was a lot of extreme temperatures. And they lived in nomadic clans. And they were consistently searching for better lands for their animals, because Mongol life was really centered on herding their animals, especially their horses, right? So if you're living this kind of lifestyle, how do you think it all impacts the way your culture is? Your culture is probably not going to be that sophisticated. But the reason why we talk about the Mongols is because they built the largest land empire in the world. And they did it all as pastoral nomads. So the early Muslim expansion, Mongols had to overcome several issues within the tribal divisions. So in Central Asia, the steppe culture, the loyalties were based purely on kinship. And they were so strong that they often prevented any broad cooperation between people in various bloodlines. So that's when you have Genghis Khan come into the picture, and he is the one who is responsible for uniting these warring tribes and to overcome these issues with bloodlines and not getting along with different kin. He actually forced them to intermarry, so that they created this common experience. They had to really get to know each other. And this practice makes it possible, or there's a possibility in the world today that 16 million people are descendants of Genghis Khan. Just think about 16 million people can trace their bloodlines back to Genghis Khan, give or take. And then, as we saw from Heimler's video, he also used military organization to help break these bonds. So they all lived together and they trained and they fought. And in battle, members of, the tribe could never leave one of their own behind. They couldn't leave somebody that was missing, or they couldn't leave a captive. So they created this shared experience. So Genghis Khan really did build up the strengths of the Mongols. Rather than promotion based on family, promotions within the military were purely based on loyalty and how well you performed in combat. They established very efficient communication networks with quick riders and horse stops along the way. They were very skilled on horseback. They rode and they practiced with bows. They practiced hunting strategies. And all of this was important not only for the Mongols to sustain themselves, but also for the victory and the expansion. Mongols were one of the first who could actually travel up to 100 miles a day on horseback. I couldn't imagine having to ride a horse for 100 miles in a single day. Cruel and unusual punishment. I actually highly recommend the video down below right here. Not the 10 horrifying facts, but the TED Ed. It is absolutely fantastic. So as we know from Heimler's video, Genghis Khan was all about the expansion. He could have stayed, lived a pretty life, but then we wouldn't be talking about the Mongols. So his empire at one point in time encompassed all of the Silk Road. And trade once again began to flow freely from Asia all the way into Europe. He would sack Baghdad and he would end the Islamic Caliphate of the Abbasid dynasty. Now, what's really funny about this, or interesting, I shouldn't say funny, interesting, is that in Arabic, Khan actually means deceiver or to deceive, because the Muslims, or the caliphates, the people who lived, the Persians in the Middle East, didn't trust the Mongols because they were consistently ransacked. The Mongols destroyed the Seljuk Turks and paved the way for the rise of the Ottomans. They also ruled over Russia as a tributary system. Do you remember back to China when we talked about the tributary system, where they had to pay offerings and homage to the ruler? And then eventually Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, would establish the Yuan dynasty, overthrowing the Song dynasty, as we have learned. Now, the Yuan dynasty would be the first time that an outsider would rule over China. But the two areas they could never control would be Southeast Asia, where the Delhi Sultanates in India is, and Japan. It's very interesting. So as you can see, it grows to encompass the largest land empire, not to be confused with the British Empire, which we'll talk about later, but the largest land empire, and then it all falls apart. So an Arab historian wrote, in the countries that have not yet been overrun by them, everyone spends the night afraid that they may appear there too. The Mongols were extremely feared. So besides their innate skills with horses and fighting, the Mongols used fear to help them win. So the enemy refused to surrender. Genghis would order the death of the entire population, not just that one person or a few people. Everybody would die. So the Mongols gained this reputation of going from town to town and slaughtering everybody. That's what we know of the Mongols. But if you didn't put up a fight, then they would leave you alone. You would assimilate into the Mongol way of life, or later on, the Mongols who lacked a complex culture would assimilate into yours, as with the Persians. And along the way, they began adopting technology of the people that they conquered. So, China, for instance, they would take the gunpowder from China and really turn it into the bombs that we know, primitive bombs and catapults. And then they would also use biological warfare too, but that's neither here nor there. So the Mongol destruction of Kiev actually increased the importance of Moscow in Russia, because Kiev, at one point in time, was more important than Moscow. The Yuan dynasty in China became the first non-Chinese dynasty to ever rule in East Asia, as I said before, and the Khanate in Persia actually helped control the Silk Road, which meant for the first time non-Muslims were actually ruling over an Islamic empire. It's pretty awesome if you minus all the death and destruction. So this picture here actually shows you which dictators killed the most people. And I know that it's kind of hard to see, but let me just put it to you this way. This is Kim Il-sung. This is North Korea, the first one to establish the dictatorship. You've got Pol Pot in Cambodia, which we'll talk about. You've got Hideki Tojo, which is in charge, World War II. You have Adolf Hitler here with 17 million. You've got Joseph Stalin with 23, which I definitely will have that debate over who's worse. We'll look at that. And then you have Mao Zedong, after the Cultural Revolution in China, who is responsible for about 78 million deaths. And where does Genghis Khan fit on this list? Well, he fits right here, just above Joseph Stalin. Genghis Khan and his army is responsible for killing approximately 30 million people through either pillage and warfare or biological warfare by helping to spread, knowing and intentionally spreading the plague. Dun, dun, dun. So one of the significant figures that we have to talk about with the Mongols is actually Marco Polo. So as you know, Marco Polo was a European merchant, and he visited Kublai Khan's court. And Kublai Khan was so impressed with Marco Polo that he actually employed him in the Yuan dynasty in China for 17 years. And then Marco Polo would return home to Italy, where he would share his stories of China, and that actually helped increase European demand for Asian trade. So it kind of worked out well. The more interesting stories, in my opinion, comes from Iban, but that's neither here nor there. So the Mongols were known for their merciless battle, but they didn't care to rule. And if we know anything about history, we know that if you're expanding, you also have to care about ruling if you want to maintain your empire in your your area of reach. So the Mongol Khans often let their conquered people just run themselves. They just paid tribute rather than directly ruling them. And that meant that there was often the mixing of cultures. So in the East, the Mongols would embrace and convert to Buddhism, and in the West, the Mongols would convert to Islam. And that's it. That's our story of the Mongols. Well, you'll see. We'll talk more about them in class. Bye, guys.